It was time, really. The reason all of us in the Beatles shied away from Beatles material directly after the breakup.
Whenever people imagine Paul McCartney, they usually conjure up the image of a cheerful young Beatle with smooth bass lines and a cheeky grin. He's remembered as the creative force behind Yesterday, the face of global fame, and the man who reshaped pop music, forever changing the game. But peel back the fame, the knighthood, and the stadium lights, and you'll discover someone far more calculated. Behind that charming smile and polished presence is a musician with a razor-sharp mind and opinions that slice deeper than you'd think. Although Paul McCartney often comes off as the diplomat of the Fab Four, those who've worked shoulder to shoulder with him have seen another side. In private circles, it's no secret. When it comes to music, Paul speaks plainly and pulls no punches. He doesn't tiptoe around his preferences. He knows what resonates with him and isn't afraid to shut the door on what doesn't. Across the years, he's quietly but consistently locked horns with some of the biggest names in the business, often drawing a hard line over what makes music truly meaningful. So today, we're peeling back the curtain to reveal 6 bands Paul McCartney never vibed with, and the reasons why not even music royalty escaped his biting commentary. Let's begin with the band whose rivalry with the Beatles helped define an entire generation, the Rolling Stones. Are they genuine musical challengers or just blues impersonators? Let's take a closer look at McCartney's history with the Stones. For decades, fans hailed the Beatles-Stones face-off as the greatest rock and roll rivalry. But Paul's behind-the-scenes stance told a different story. In a quiet moment during an Abbey Road session in '68, McCartney supposedly dropped a bomb of an opinion. He dismissed the Stones as nothing more than lucky blues imitators, a jab that didn't make headlines back then, but left a mark that still lingers. Jump ahead to 2021, and Paul was still fanning the flames during an interview with The New Yorker. He said, "The Stones are a blues cover band. Our net was cast a bit wider," a comment that didn't go unnoticed. Mick Jagger hit back, laughing off the shade by suggesting the Beatles were just a small group with one drummer, a nod to the old Ringo debate. Insiders have always claimed Paul thought the Stones followed the Beatles' every move, from concepts to sounds, always a step behind. One moment that really struck a nerve came in 1969, when Lennon talked about producing a Rolling Stones album. Paul was furious and reportedly asked why John would waste his talent on a band he believed had nothing new to offer. Sure, McCartney has occasionally thrown out some compliments when talking about Stones songs, but even those moments are laced with a subtle chill, a carefully measured tone that never fully softens. Listen closely to his interviews, and you'll catch it. A flicker in his voice, a trace of something unresolved. And if that's how candid he was about his musical peers from the golden era, just wait until you hear his take on the rebellious punks who tried to shake the foundation of rock altogether. When Paul McCartney looked back at the music scene, few genres rattled him like punk. Fueled by chaos, defiance, and gritty rebellion, punk was everything Paul had not spent decades perfecting. At the very core of that aggressive movement stood a band that made noise into a weapon, the infamous Sex Pistols. Their explosive arrival in 1976 wasn't just a raucous debut, it was a declaration aimed straight at the heart of rock royalty. For McCartney, their disdainful tone wasn't art, it was provocation in disguise. He once remarked that the Pistols didn't play music, they attacked with noise, leaving him baffled over how bad became a badge of honor. But the tension didn't stay on vinyl. It became personal and loud. Johnny Rotten, never shy with insults, tossed McCartney aside with a sneer, branding him an out-of-touch relic. What tipped things from irritation to fury was something far more symbolic and disrespectful. Wings drummer Denny Sewell later revealed that the Pistols literally used Beatles posters for target practice. Paul pretended to laugh it off publicly, but friends said the insult left a scar he didn't show. Then came an awkward moment that turned cold in a second. In early 1977, both bands found themselves at Air Studios, and McCartney, ever the gentleman, reached out. But Sid Vicious snarled, "Establishment sellout," as he passed, snapping the goodwill instantly. Paul simply walked away, silent and stern, and never glanced their way again. While McCartney later conceded that punk had helped shake up a stale industry, the Pistols remained a sore subject. When their name came up, he would mutter, "Not my cup of tea," lips tight and eyes colder than frost. But not every feud came from rebellion. Some came from fans who got too close. Enter Oasis, a band whose admiration for the Beatles morphed into something more like imitation on steroids. Paul had dealt with many copycats over the years, but none clung to the Beatles' image quite like the Gallagher brothers. In the mid-90s, as Britpop surged, Oasis loudly proclaimed themselves the next Beatles. From their outfits to their interviews, they didn't just idolize the Fab Four, they became a living parody. To the average fan, it looked like tribute, but to McCartney, it came off as hollow mimicry. He initially played the diplomat, giving Oasis credit for their energy and ambition. But privately, Paul confided that the flattery felt forced, like a business move wearing Beatles skin. What truly got under his skin wasn't just the sound, but the swagger. Noel Gallagher even dared to echo Lennon's bigger than Jesus sentiment, claiming Oasis had surpassed the Beatles. Paul took offense, not because of the quote, but because it lacked the wit and irony John had. He felt their music was bombastic and surface level, missing the soul the Beatles had poured in. As he once put it, copying our chords isn't the same as living the journey. What stung most was their belief that they deserved the Beatles' legacy by default. Oasis didn't just idolize, they acted as if the throne had already been passed. Paul couldn't hide his irritation. It felt to him like they were idol-chasing shadows rather than building anything authentic. Yet among the copycats, one band took it a step further and somehow still earned a bizarre place in Beatles history. Because when it came to the Monkees, Paul's reaction was far from simple. He didn't just feel mimicked, he felt oddly torn. The Monkees, created for television and self-aware in their parody, became a cultural force. Top-charting tracks, a blockbuster TV show, and screaming crowds. But for Paul McCartney, their act felt hollow. He reportedly dismissed the band as little more than a commercial gimmick. According to Beatles aide Alistair Taylor, Paul would instantly flip the dial anytime their songs hit the airwaves. It wasn't just the music that grated on him. Paul's real issue was with the illusion the Monkees represented. While he had slogged through years in smoky Hamburg clubs, barely scraping by, these actors had been handed glory without earning it. The real turning point came when the Monkees adopted the Beatles' psychedelic flair. Right after St. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band reshaped music, George Harrison once remembered Paul fuming over it. "They're copying our formula and skipping the struggle." That frustration even spilled into personal moments. At a 1968 party in Los Angeles, Paul allegedly left mid-conversation with Monkees frontman Mickey Dolenz. Dolenz later reflected on the encounter, saying, "I don't think he ever believed we were actual musicians." Even as the Monkees evolved and began composing their own music, Paul's view remained largely unmoved. When asked about them in a 2011 interview, Paul gave one of his famously sharp compliments. "Catchy tunes, sure, but they weren't us." Time may have softened his grin, but the underlying disapproval never fully disappeared. Then came the next act. Not imitators, but challengers who actually dethroned the Beatles on the charts. While Paul's musical momentum began to falter, the Bee Gees surged ahead with disco fever dominating the airwaves. By the late 70s, McCartney was watching his reign slip as rock gave way to the flashing lights of the disco boom. At the forefront were the Gibb brothers, the Bee Gees, whose falsetto hooks and Saturday Night Fever soundtrack broke records worldwide. For many listeners, the Bee Gees represented brilliance, a bold sonic shift that captured the spirit of a changing era. But to Paul McCartney, they felt like a glossed-up version of past success, Beatles DNA repackaged with synthesizers and sparkle. Wings guitarist Lawrence Juber recalled Paul's reaction. He'd listen, roll his eyes, and mutter, "Same three chords as everyone else, just faster." Tensions were quietly boiling beneath the surface as the Bee Gees shattered chart records once held by the Beatles in 1979. Things took a sharper turn when fate placed Paul and the Bee Gees in the same Miami recording facility. To steer clear of any direct encounter, Paul is said to have meticulously planned his sessions to never overlap with theirs. One engineer on site once brought up the Bee Gees surpassing yet another Beatles benchmark. Paul didn't say a word, but the tension in his expression said everything. Even when he tried to maintain a gracious exterior, a chill still lingered in his demeanor. When Maurice Gibb died in 2003, McCartney issued a short, emotionally distant tribute, just a few sparse words. It stood in stark contrast to the warmth he had shown in honoring other fallen legends from his era. People close to the situation say that while Paul kept things professional outwardly, his personal bitterness never really disappeared. Still, if McCartney had trouble digesting the success of disco stars or punk provocateurs, it paled in comparison to the creative weight of one particular band. This was no ordinary rivalry. It began with admiration, but collapsed into silence and emotional distance. The Beach Boys. Though McCartney has publicly praised God Only Knows, at one point calling it flawless, the truth behind that compliment was complicated. When Pet Sounds debuted in 1966, Paul didn't see it as just another album. It was a creative awakening. He dove deep into its textures, playing it over and over to dissect the harmonies and structure. George Martin, the Beatles' producer, confirmed that Pet Sounds sparked a direct and powerful influence on the creation of Sgt. Pepper. But what began as artistic awe quickly shifted into a pressure-fueled contest when Brian Wilson started working on Smile. Paul kept a close eye on Wilson's project, but reportedly lost sympathy once Wilson's mental health struggles derailed it. At the time, McCartney's alleged response was blunt. If you can't finish your work, maybe you shouldn't be in the game at all. Their quiet feud hit a tipping point during a dinner at Wilson's house in 1967, when Paul casually dismissed some Beach Boys songs as too basic. Wilson was so emotionally affected that he reportedly withdrew from conversation for several days. Even years later, when Paul referenced the Beach Boys, his praise often came with subtle asterisks. They had nice vocals, he admitted in one chat, but people exaggerate their impact. We were already breaking ground on our own. Even when revisiting God Only Knows, Paul would often include a caveat. Yes, it's perfect, but only for what American pop music was doing at the time. Some say it best, but music historian David Leaf nailed it when he said that while Paul held great regard for Brian's achievements, he rarely gave full credit, because doing so would mean facing the uncomfortable truth that someone else may have helped mold the Beatles' genius. That, in many ways, is the core of McCartney's most personal rivalries. Not always who he disliked, but the ones he could never quite confess had sparked something deep in him. So, looking back, these are 6 artists or bands that genuinely ruffled Paul McCartney's feathers. From chaotic punks who spat on his legend, to disco icons who stole his thunder, to brilliant contemporaries who inadvertently became his motivators. It appears that even the greatest names in the business weren't shielded from McCartney's silent, biting judgments. Whether those tensions arose from stylistic clashes, personal pride, or the complex dance of influence and resentment. But if there's one takeaway from all of this, it's that behind Paul's ever-youthful grin and gentlemanly demeanor lies an unshakable loyalty to the music empire he helped create. So tell us, did any of these rivalries catch you off guard? Were Paul's reactions rooted in fairness or just the discomfort of seeing his musical world evolve? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed digging into this lesser-seen dimension of a music legend, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you don't miss out on more revealing stories. Because no matter how flawless the spotlight may seem, every music icon carries a hidden storm behind their stage smile.